Let's go ahead and get started. It looks like a good number of people are here. So, welcome to the AM LGBTQ Alliance's Task Force for Trans Inclusion's Allyship 101 webinar that we're doing in observance of International Trans Day of Visibility, which will be on Sunday. My name is Anna Wotan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Assistant Collections Manager at the Atlanta History Center, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the Task Force for Trans Inclusion. I'm joined today by my fellow co-chair, Allison, and one of our task force members, Alex. Allison, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Kennedy. I am currently the Visitor Experience Lead at Franklin Park Conservatory and Botanical Gardens in Columbus, Ohio. And like Anna said, I am the co-chair for the Task Force for Transgender Inclusion.
And I'm Alex Lussenhoff. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am a Research and Evaluation Associate at the Museum of Science in Boston.
Awesome. Thanks. So I'm going to go ahead and send out our first poll. This will be a set of questions that just pop up on your screen. Go ahead and answer them while you listen to the intro portion of this, and we'll report them out here in just a few minutes. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about the task force and the toolkit that we've released recently. So the Task Force for Trans Inclusion is a group of trans museum professionals and close allies spread all across the US with a couple members who are international as well. So our main purpose for the last year has been working on a toolkit for gender transitions and trans inclusion in the museum field. And we've completed that and released it just a few weeks ago. It's available now on AAM's website on the LGBTQ Alliances page. And it's free to download, so go take a look at it, share it with your friends. It looks at trans inclusion and facilitating gender transitions from 3 different points of view. The transitioning professional, the institution, and coworkers. And the coworkers guide has a lot of really useful definitions and charts and the answers to a lot of frequently asked questions. So it's a very good place to start self-educating about trans inclusion. So for the webinar today, we're going to be looking at the very basics of trans allyship. In November, we'll be doing a more in-depth webinar that'll be looking at telling trans stories within collections and programming, education, and exhibits. So if you have a bit more knowledge about trans issues, or if you feel more prepared after this one, join us then for that more in-depth conversation. We're also hosting a panel and a roundtable at AAM this year in New Orleans that'll be a bit more in-depth than this webinar as well. So the main structure of this webinar is going to be looking at things that you can do right now to help foster trans inclusion and things you can do with a little bit of effort and institutional buy-in. So the first thing that we want to look at are before we start that, I should note that everybody is muted for this. We've done it on purpose. We're at max capacity for the number of people participating. So if people are able to unmute themselves, it's going to become a bit of a mess fairly quickly. If you have any questions, just type them into the chat box. As we go, Alex will be collecting and compiling questions, and we'll check in with him periodically throughout the webinar to answer your questions as we go, and then also at the end for the question and answer section. So the first thing we want to look at today are pronouns. If you've attempted to educate yourself on trans inclusion at all in the past, or if you've had any contact with the trans community, you've probably heard pronouns mentioned a lot. And it's because they're very important. They help us and other people communicate a part of who you are to everybody else. Everybody has pronouns, whether you're trans or not. Most common binary pronouns are she, her, hers, and he, him, his. Most of you here in the webinar today will use those. The most common non-binary pronouns are they, them, theirs. You'll hear arguments sometimes about non-binary pronouns, especially they, them, theirs, being not grammatically correct. And it's really a silly argument. Non-binary pronouns like singular they have been used in English for hundreds of years. You can find them in classical writing as well, such as in Dickens and Shakespeare. And it more than likely you're using singular they as a pronoun every day in your own speech. For example, if I told you I went to the doctor this morning, more than likely, if you're in the US, your response would be, well, what did they say? And that's an example there of singular they. You would use it there the same way that you would use it for your non-binary friends, family, colleagues. So there really is no excuse not to be using it. No matter what somebody's pronouns are, you should always use the ones that they request for you. If you don't, it shows them that you don't care about them. You don't see them as who they actually are, and it can create a very tense work environment. And a little note to remember is that when somebody gives you what their pronouns are and what their name is, that's usually retroactive unless they tell you otherwise. So if you're talking about a trans individual who you know now and who you knew in the past, you would always use their current pronouns unless they ask you otherwise. You would never say back when they were a boy or back when they were a girl or that sort of thing. It's very disrespectful. They were always the gender that they tell you they are now, whether you knew it then or not. So trans people usually have to share their pronouns to be gendered correctly and to be respected. But when they're the only people who are sharing their pronouns, it singles them out. It can be very isolating, and it often signals that they are trans. It can be very outing. So there are a few things that allies can do to help normalize the sharing of pronouns. And these are things that, as we mentioned, you can do now, you can do today while you're watching the webinar, you can do it immediately after. The first thing is adding your pronouns to your email signature. This helps remove any confusion, especially if your name is more of a gender neutral name, but it also signals that you are an ally, that you're trying to normalize this practice. Usually how that looks is you'll have your name and then your title and then your pronouns and then your contact information. That's at least how it is here at the Atlanta History Center. All of our staff are allowed to and encouraged to include their pronouns in their email signatures. How mine is, for example, it's Anna Wotan, Assistant Collections Manager, pronouns, she, her, hers, and then our contact information. And it's a very simple and quick way. You can do it. You only have to do it once because it's in your signature. So it's a very easy thing to start off with. The other thing you can do is using pronoun pins and badges and ribbons. You can see here the one I have. These are the ones at the Atlanta History Center, created for staff and volunteer use. We also pass them out at community events like focus groups or advisory groups to make sure that everybody can feel represented. And then we give them out for free at events like Pride as well. They have been extremely popular. Lots of our staff wear them. It's been a really great initiative. You can go out and find one yourself and wear it every day. They're great to wear at conferences when you're constantly meeting new people. And it helps signal as well to trans colleagues or future colleagues that you may be meeting at conferences that you are an ally, that you are interested in inclusion and diversity. So it's another really great thing to do. The third thing you can consider doing is using your pronouns when you introduce yourself, whether that's when you're introducing yourself to a new person or introducing yourself at meetings. Some institutions at the beginning of their meetings will go around the table and everyone will give their name, their department, and their pronouns, or just their name and their pronouns. And again, it helps to normalize this practice of people offering their pronouns. That may look like, for example, hi, my name is Anna, my pronouns are she, her, hers. It's as simple as that. It might feel a little uncomfortable at first, but with a bit of practice, you'll get used to it. You have to imagine that trans people, when they're the only people doing it, how uncomfortable it is for them. So it's a little bit of uncomfortableness that you can get over with some effort. It's important to remember that pronoun sharing, while you should encourage it and while you should always model it, should always be voluntary. If you mandate pronoun sharing in any situation, you take the chance of putting a trans individual who is still in the closet into the position of having to choose between misgendering themselves or outing themselves. And it's a very stressful and terrible position to be in. I know that from experience. So it should always be voluntary to give your pronouns, but it's really good for you to always model that so that other people catch on as well. Alex, do we have any questions that have come up so far through this first section?
Yes, just one. So one question that just came up is, what might be a secondary option for individuals in an organization that don't necessarily wear name badges, say in an office or a cubicle, other option?
Yes. So the individual pins like this, this is just a normal pin that you can pin to your shirt. These are very easy to find. You can find them all over the place online. Etsy is a great place to look. It's a great place to support local artists. Most Pride celebrations will have them as well. A lot of companies will sell them in person. If you find LGBTQ bookstores or stores or anything like that, you can find them. And it's really easy just to wear them on your lapel or to attach them to a lanyard that you might wear or on your bag or something like that. You can even hang up the pins if you're in a cubicle that has a fabric siding to it. You can always attach the pin to the cubicle. There's some sort of name tag on there or something. So there's a lot of different ways. And the pins and ribbons and buttons are really easy ways to do that even without a name badge. Do we have another question, Alex?
One simple question, I think, and I think the answer is yes, but is this webinar going to be archived online anywhere after?
Sorry. So we are recording it. I'm not sure yet where it will be available, but we'll make sure that when it is available, that AM will make an announcement about it. There'll be a tweet or a Facebook post or something about it so that you can easily find it once it is available.
And then another pronoun-related question is that pronouns be something you'd recommend adding to business cards?
Yes, if your institution allows you to, absolutely. That's just another great way to normalize it. I would say add them to whatever you can get away with. Some institutions won't allow you as much leeway as others, depending on what your marketing looks like and what your institutional policies look like. But just do as much as you can, I would say. So next, Allison, why don't you talk a little bit about gender neutral language?
Absolutely. Gender neutral language is one of the most important things that you can do to make everyone feel respected, safe, and accepted in your institution. While you may not understand someone's gender or know what someone's gender is, it's important to use language that's respectful towards them. While it may be difficult at first, like we've said, language is ingrained. It's important to challenge your typical speech patterns and behaviors. And remember that practice makes perfect and that the effort of trying makes a great deal. For example, we have some examples from one of the charts in our toolkit. For example, saying, "Are your mom and dad here?" to a child in your institution is not inclusive of all families, including families with non-binary parents. So consider asking, "Is there an adult here with you?" Or, "Can you tell me where your grown-up is?" These words achieve the same meaning, but without being exclusive of non-binary people and LGBTQ parents. Gendered language, another one, such as "Hey boys and girls" when addressing a group of children, or "Hey ladies" when addressing a group of coworkers, can be very harmful to non-binary individuals, and I say this with a lot of personal experience. It gets really old very quickly, so try and avoid those gendered phrases. You can try using friends or colleagues, distinguished guests when addressing a group of people, y'all, folks, friends, everyone. There are lots of gender inclusive terms that you can use for groups and individuals. And that just shows that you're being thoughtful with your language. That's one of the most important things you can do, is be very thoughtful. If someone asks you not to use a specific word or words for them, make the effort to correct your language. And remember that when you do make mistakes, because it will happen, it happens to all of us, quickly correct yourself and move on. Your apology does not need to be a production that then draws attention to yourself and your mistake. That ends up putting the burden on the person who you've misgendered. It makes them feel like they have to make you feel better. And like Anna said earlier, especially when you're thinking about singular they, the more you practice it, the better you'll get. And I promise you do it all the time. Another example, oh no, that person in front of me, they left their wallet. I bet they will miss it. I should run after them. In that context, you wouldn't hesitate to use that. So give it a try and continue practicing in all parts of your life. My partner and I used to volunteer at an LGBTQ youth center, and we actually assigned a pronoun to each of our pets to practice using the different non-binary pronouns that some of the youth were using to get more comfortable with them when it was in a low stakes situation. So find ways to practice for yourself. Alex, how else can allies stand up for trans individuals in their lives?
Thanks, Allison. So another really great thing that allies can do is by standing up for trans people, standing up for friends and colleagues, even and maybe especially when they're not physically near you or around you. So trans people, we often do stand up for ourselves and correct people when they misgender us, but it can get tiring. It's a lot of energy, and it can make you feel lonely and vulnerable. And there are some circumstances where we might not feel safe standing up for ourselves or correcting someone who's misgendering us or being disrespectful. So that's a great place for an ally to step in. So one very easy thing to do is when, if you have a trans colleague or something, is if you hear someone using the incorrect name or incorrect pronouns for that person, it's just to correct them. The person might not know that that's the person's correct name or pronouns, in which case you'll be helping them find that out. And other times people do know, but they actually are being careless or disrespectful, which are both situations that you want to correct. So say, there's a common example, maybe you're in a group setting like a meeting, if the trans person is there. If you do hear someone using the wrong name or pronouns, it is okay to interject briefly and correct them, again, without making a production out of it, just by saying she, or, using the correct name that the person uses instead of the name that the incorrect name. Usually it's just that someone forgot or is making a mistake and need to be reminded. Another thing you can do if you can't correct in the moment is to, if you're in a meeting like this, find an excuse to say something next using that person's correct name and pronouns. So if someone has said something using the incorrect name and pronouns, then you speak soon after and, make not an over-the-top point, but make a point to say, oh, I agree with what Jane said about the label text. I think she has the right idea, just kind of reinforcing for everyone else in the room that that's the correct name and the correct pronoun. Sometimes people also have this idea that they only have to use someone's name or pronouns when that person is not around, or when that person is around. Sorry, that's not true. You should always be using someone's name and pronouns, their correct name and their correct pronouns that they've told you. So just as an example of this, recently my wife and I, this isn't at work, but it was in my personal life, my wife and I were visiting her family in New Jersey, and a family friend of theirs was at dinner with us talking about her adult child who had just come out as non-binary and was using they, them, theirs pronouns. So the mom kind of admitted to us all like, oh, well, I use those pronouns sometimes, but I don't really try when she's not around. So she's misgendering her kid in the process and saying, I don't really bother when my kid isn't near me. So my wife, in this great display of allyship, said, oh, that's great. Why don't we help you practice right now at dinner? So we started modeling and asking questions about this person's child, saying, oh, they just moved to Brooklyn. Oh, that's so interesting. Where are they living? Do they have a job yet? That sort of thing. So with everyone else trying and kind of setting an example around her, I could tell that the mom was also starting to try a little bit as well. Maybe she felt a little bit embarrassed, but we were kind of modeling the right behavior. So this is all to say that when you're learning a new name and pronouns for somebody, it's really, really important to use those name and pronouns even when they're not around. Because, and echo what the presenters have said before, that you're probably going to make some mistakes, and it's better to make mistakes when that person isn't there. You're learning something new, you're overwriting outdated information in your brain, that's okay. But that's why practice is important. So another thing that you can do as an ally is after, maybe a coworker comes out or a friend comes out, is to suggest to all the other people around you that this is something you all can practice together when that person is not around. So sort of suggest that as an idea and model that behavior. I have another cisgender friend who has a standing invitation to anyone that she will volunteer, call them on the phone, and they can just practice, using a person's new name and pronouns for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes as much as they want to. So that's a great way of being an ally as well. And then more obviously, if you hear others talking about your trans friends or colleagues in a really disrespectful way, you should speak up to make sure that people know that it's not appropriate and that you don't agree with them. Sometimes people express discriminatory views kind of with the assumption that everyone secretly agrees with them. So that's a great point to cut that off and make sure they know that you don't agree with them and it's not okay. So if you hear someone saying bigoted or discriminatory things about your coworker or colleague or about trans people in general, speak up and tell them to stop. It's also really unprofessional. And another example of an inappropriate conversation you might need to head off is if people are speculating about a coworker's medical transition or personal life or personal details about the fact that they're trans. It's also a good time to speak up and say that's really not anyone's business here at work. And then finally, another thing you can do is boosting other trans people's voices. So adding your voice to their own to amplify it. So this, I was sharing a lot of examples of making a correction and being an ally yourself, but when trans people are sort of sharing their ideas or speaking up for themselves, you can amplify their voices. So if you had a trans colleague who was advocating for more trans representation in an exhibit, you could agree with them publicly, add your voice to theirs and say, I think this is a really good idea. And then, if you're active on social media, another great thing you could do is follow diverse, trans people with diverse perspectives, maybe in the museum field and outside the museum field, and retweet, post, follow, etc., and just expose yourself to those points of view. So us presenters here, we're all on Twitter. The authors of the guide, probably a lot of them are on Twitter as well. And you can follow the AM LGBTQ Alliance if you don't already. And another great follow for kind of queer museum issues in general is Margaret Middleton. We can share Margaret's Twitter handle as well. And then there's lots and lots of public trans activists like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox who are great follows. And there's like a million lists out there. If you Google great trans people to follow on Twitter, you'll get 25 suggestions right away. So Allison, I will kick it back to you.
Thank you. So it looks like we do have another poll going right now. So what are your pronouns? So go ahead and fill that one out as well. And then I think right now we have some time for some questions, actually. We have one here. If I were to make pronoun buttons available, what are other non-binary pronouns you would suggest to be the most inclusive? For instance, is Z-Zem still utilized? Z-Zem is still utilized. I would say not as much. If you're putting funds into creating buttons that you'll give out, my recommendation would be to do she, her, he, him, and they, them. And then I would actually recommend having one that just says my pronouns are and blank and give people the option to fill them in themselves. Especially if you're investing in branding buttons for your institution, I would recommend that. Anna or Alex, do you have thoughts on that?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question, do you have advice for when students or children ask about the pronoun buttons? Would you refer to the adult or explain that this is your pronouns? So I get this a lot, actually. I tend to just get, are you a boy or a girl? Actually, it's never about the pronouns. And I tend to be honest with children, like I usually say neither, right? Or if I get asked about my pronouns, which mine at my full-time job are on a button as well. On my lanyard, they're on two, actually. I just explain that those are the pronouns that I use, and I don't usually get a lot of pushback on that. People don't tend to understand it, but it doesn't tend to be something that's pushback. The thing I have gotten the most, actually, at my former full-time job were trans kids and like trans young adults who would come in and see themselves in the institution. When my museum added pronouns specifically to our name badges, when I was hired, I was one of 2 trans people on staff, and when I left, I was one of 6. And it was because we became known as a safe place for trans people to work. And then another good question, I struggle with a gender inclusive option for ma'am or sir. Specifically, if I need to get someone's attention who I don't know, et cetera, are there any good ideas for that? And then a follow-up, that it's years of use and habit, but would like to know a more inclusive but formal term. To my knowledge, there is not a good formal term for it. Specifically, if you're looking at ma'am and sir, I use friend, excuse me, hello, any kind of word that's not gendered to get someone's attention, because I do try and avoid ma'am and sir. Anna, you might have a better one or an idea. I don't.
As far as getting people's attention, I just use excuse me. I'm down here in Atlanta right now, so ma'am and sir is used a lot. And in general, I just avoid it unless I already know somebody's pronouns. If you already know that somebody uses she, her, or he, him, then ma'am and sir are fine. If they're wearing a button or a ribbon that says my pronouns are she, her, or he, him, then ma'am and sir are fine. But for everybody else, I usually just say excuse me or something like that to get their attention.
Wonderful. So now we're going to talk about some things that may take a little bit more effort or a little bit more institutional buy-in. First, we're going to talk about bathrooms. Bathrooms can and have been a battleground for trans inclusion in recent years. In the United States, we have seen numerous legislation attempts trying to regulate bathroom access for trans and gender nonconforming individuals. It's a very scary situation to be in a public place as a trans or gender nonconforming person and have to use the restroom, where there is always a risk of being questioned, harassed, even attacked, and safety is something that we kind of always have on our minds as trans people, especially in restrooms. My partner and I went to go see Hamilton with some friends a couple of months ago, and it's a historic theater that does not have gender inclusive restrooms. So when they asked me to go to the restroom, my partner asked me to go to the restroom with them, I asked if they wanted me to go or someone who was more femme than them to go with them. And so our friend went with them, and it was a good thing that she did, because they got questioned by multiple people and snarky comments about, this is the women's restroom line, right? It's a constant kind of struggle. So if you in your institution make gender inclusive bathrooms a priority, it's truly an accessibility issue for trans people as well as gender nonconforming people, families, individuals with caretakers, among others. And providing publicly accessible, well-labeled gender inclusive bathrooms signals to the community at large that you're a welcoming and inclusive institution for anybody. When labeling your restrooms, be thoughtful about your signage. Do research. There are a lot of options. It's important for visitors to know that the facilities are gender inclusive. And however accessible they are, they can be accessible in multiple ways. You may choose to label it with a picture of a toilet or a urinal, depending on what facilities are in the restroom, as well as the words gender inclusive or gender neutral, and avoid signage that shows pictures of men and women, the sign that has like man image line, woman image, avoid that one because it is exclusive of non-binary people as well. And then all restrooms should be accessible without a special key or without asking staff for assistance. No one should have to out themselves to use the restroom in your institution. And then make sure that your staff restrooms are accessible as well. The other big thing is to make sure that your policies are clear around inclusive restrooms, so that your staff know the policies and that visitors know your policies. You want to make it clear that visitors, the trans people and all visitors are welcome to use the facilities that they're most comfortable with. And then provide your staff with language surrounding that policy so that they have the best chance of talking with visitors about it if it comes up. That's just one institutional thing that you can do on like a larger scale. So Anna is going to talk a little bit about the institutional transition guidelines that we talked about in the toolkit.
Yes. So institutional transition guidelines they're just a formal document that lays out the policies and procedures and step-by-step of what to do if a person needs to transition. And it also lays out the expectations of the person transitioning and of the institution and of their coworkers. So it lays out the whole process ahead of time so nobody has any questions. Transitioning can be a very stressful and frankly terrifying process to go through. When I transitioned here at the History Center, History Center was amazing, but I was the first person to transition here, which means we had no policies. Nobody had any idea what to do. So there were a couple meetings with my HR representative where we were sitting in her office and asking each other, what do we do next? Who do we need to tell? What needs to happen? And it made the situation a lot more stressful because I'm not an HR professional. I shouldn't have to come up with these plans. So having a document in place before somebody transitions helps make the process easier for everybody involved. The transition guidelines should be thorough, but they need to be flexible as well. Every transition is going to be different. Some people are going to want to rip the Band-Aid off and make the announcement, and then the next day present how they're needing to present with new names and pronouns. Some people might stretch it out over a couple months to where there are meetings with people throughout a month or two before, and then there's a set date. And some people may not set a date, they just may gradually change how they present themselves over time, and people just adjust to that as it goes. And all of those are very valid ways to transition, but there are many ways to transition as there are people. So having a plan that is thorough but flexible and adaptable really helps make the situation easier for everyone. These guidelines and any other policies you may have, for example, if your institution keeps the toolkit on file as well, which we recommend, all of these resources should be available in a place that employees can access discreetly. Nobody should have to out themselves to look at these resources. Transition planning often starts months or years before somebody's institution is even notified. I know I started looking at my institution's policy and lack thereof a year and a half before I finally came out to HR. So it was a very long process. I was very worried that when I came out I was going to lose my job because that's still the predominant narrative. For those of you joining us from within the US, in most states here, it is still perfectly legal for someone to be fired or evicted from their home if they come out as trans, or if somebody finds out they're trans, or if somebody perceives them as being trans. So it's still a very real fear. And I know people even within the last year who have been fired and evicted because they came out as trans. So having these policies in place and available and visible lets your employees know that it's okay, that they can be themselves, they can take the steps they need to take without fear of losing their jobs. Allison, why don't you give us a few more things that people can do?
We talked about buttons and we talked about staff badges. Like I said, the museum that I used to work at and one that I currently still work at have pronouns directly on the name tag. So this is one that doesn't have it, but I'll show you this one. So where it says my title here on my name badge, if you can read that, instead of saying my title, it says my pronoun. So it says Allison Kennedy, they, them, theirs. And then another one actually has my department as well as pronouns : they, them, theirs. They're a really great way for institutions to provide pronoun recognition for their staff. I think if you are looking to do something more along the lines of buttons or name tags, make sure that you talk to your staff and train your staff to look for them and to make sure that they're using the pronouns that they see and not the ones that they assume when they see someone who they may or may not know. I wear a pronoun button every day and I still get misgendered regularly at work because people forget to look. So I think if you're going to make those kinds of moves, then you want to make sure that you're providing everyone the best opportunity to succeed that you can. And then if you are in human resources, one of the best things you can do is check for health insurance, check your health insurance policies that you provide for your staff, and do your best to make sure that they're trans inclusive. Healthcare is a big struggle for trans people. I recently broke my ankle, and I have to go through with every single doctor. Like being a trans person comes up, even though it's not related to my broken ankle. My partner has gone to the doctor for a sinus infection and gotten questioned for why they're on testosterone. And then it somehow is related to their sinus infection. So make sure that if you're providing healthcare insurance for your staff, that it is as inclusive as you can get, and make that a priority. Do we have any more questions? Let's see. Is there a template or example we could access for policies? Absolutely. So the toolkit has the institutional guideline has a great set of kind of examples. There are also many that you can find online through different HR resources. And we've provided links in the toolkit to some of the resources that we used when writing the sample policies there.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that specifically of the 3 documents, the one directed at trans individuals. That one has, I know for sure, at least 3 different examples of transition plans that a trans employee could use that might inform a policy. And then there's also some recommendations for policies and some of the other documents.
Yeah, the institutional guide has it as well. And the transition guidelines, the institutional transition guidelines in there are really great. They're from the Tacoma Art Museum, which has done a lot for trans inclusion. Yeah, so check it out. It's free. And it's a really great example to base yours off of. So we have about 15 minutes left for questions. I think Alex, are we caught up on questions?
Yep, I think so. So if anyone's been holding them in.
So we do have 15 minutes for questions. So please do send them into the chat box if you have them.
This is always the time that I tell people, ask what you want to ask. I may tell you never to ask another trans person ever again, but I probably will give you some kind of answer. And if you want to send it to one of us privately as well, so you don't want anyone to know that you're asking, you are more than welcome to do that as well.
So we have a question about visitor surveys and including appropriate gender options. So there is not an example within the toolkit. Do you have an answer for that, Alex?
I do. I wrote a research article about this actually. But I can include it in, I don't know, any resources that we send, but several different options for what kinds of gender options to include in a visitor survey. It really kind of depends on the survey format, but one of the best practices, I think, is to at least include somewhere in there an open-ended option. It doesn't have to be fully open-ended, depending on the type of survey you have, but there are some great examples to provide. Something not to do on a visitor survey or any kind of survey is to make the option look like man and woman and transgender, or like that transgender is its own gender. Some people might identify that way, but a lot of trans people, don't identify necessarily as just transgender. They might have like a transgender man or transgender woman or non-binary instead. So it's not like a third gender that's apart from all the other genders that are normal, just as a basic thing, but I can share that with folks. And Anna, you were about to say something as well, so feel free to.
Yeah, I think it's important to ask it in 2 questions. When you ask your gender, like Alex said, don't list it as male, female, trans male, trans female, because that's insinuating that trans women are not actually women and trans men are not actually men. So I would suggest listing, male, female, non-binary, self-described, and then in a second question ask, are you cisgender or transgender? And that really gets at the heart of the information you're looking for without being offensive. Alex, do we have some more coming in?
Yeah. Do we have a museum in mind that you see as best practices either in the States or abroad regarding trans inclusion?
So personally, I don't think any museum is there yet. Trans inclusion is really just now in the last 2 years or so becoming a buzzword for museums, and it's very unfortunate. A lot of museums are getting there, like the Tacoma Art Museum. The Atlanta History Center is doing a lot of really great stuff as well, but I don't think anybody is there yet to be considered like as a model. So there's still room for your institution to get there, so push them. Allison, did you have anything to add?
No, I would agree with that. I think a lot of people are making steps, but I would caution anyone to pat themselves on the back quite yet, because I think, like Anna said, there's still a lot of work to be done.
There's a couple related questions coming in. So one saying, do you have any suggestions for how to be steadfast in your efforts toward trans inclusion? Discussing the topics with management who balk because it seems too political or too touchy. Another sort of related question about what to say to docents that may or may not have any experience or knowledge with gender identity, keeping language gender neutral. And then maybe the far end of the spectrum, someone who's vehemently opposed to trans and non-binary inclusion. Not that they're just not knowledgeable, but they are, actively opposed to it. So maybe talking to people who either have no knowledge or who are like vehemently anti-trans.
Yeah, the toolkit is a great place to start. The coworkers guide, you can pass it out to docents, volunteers. It has really great charts and all of that. As far as staying steadfast, just keep pushing, find other allies. If management is not on your side, find other allies within your institution who are, and start working as a group for change. The more voices you have, the more likely you're going to be able to make that change happen. And as far as people who are just completely against trans inclusion, more than likely you're not going to change their mind. Usually you can't change somebody's mind with logic if they didn't get themselves to that place in the first place with logic. But no matter what somebody's beliefs are, they should still be respectful of their coworkers, and they should still work to make sure that the workplace environment is not toxic. And things like misgendering and dead naming are toxic to a workplace environment. So whether or not they believe in trans people, they should still be using those pronouns and names just for the sake of workplace respect. Allison?
I definitely agree with that, because it's all about respect as people first. It doesn't matter whether you believe in me, I'm still here. And you still need to be respectful, anybody. Thinking about ways to be steadfast in efforts towards trans inclusion. Being the squeaky wheel works. When we at the Columbus Museum of Art were adding pronouns to our name tags, my supervisor and I at the time we were really pushing on it, just pushing in little places, and we were getting, well, it's not a priority. Well, it's too expensive to order new name tags. Well, it's not important, right? That's what we kept getting. And it actually took our executive director. She went to a film at one of our local kind of art film centers and realized that she didn't know how to refer to the person who had been helping her multiple times. She didn't know how to refer to that person. And that's when it clicked for her that this is what they're talking about. And this is why it matters that we do this kind of work at the art museum too. And so she greenlit it and we ran from there. I think just be willing to, like Anna said, find your allies, find people who are willing to go to bat for the trans people in your community, because everyone knows someone who's trans. They just might not know that they are. So yeah, and then keep yourself safe too, and mentally taken care of. Right, it's a long game. It's not Anna and I have joked that she tends to be the long game planner, and I tend to just run in head first. But it does take a long game sometimes. So be willing to do that too.
Yeah, and just to add something on that Allison mentioned, because I think it's important that even if you don't realize it, you've probably met somebody in your life who has been trans. Most studies in the past have suggested that about 1% of the population in the US is trans. Newer studies focusing on younger populations are suggesting that that number is closer to 2%, which in the grand scheme of things doesn't sound like a lot, but to put it into perspective, about 1% of the US population are redheads. And everybody within this chat probably can say that they know at least one person who's a natural redhead. So statistically, you probably at least know at least one other trans person, even if you don't know that they're trans.
We have another question about maybe getting started with trans policy implementation, especially when your organization is like affiliated with another one, like a museum that's affiliated with the university, or kind of interconnected policies like that. What are some good places to start when you're working in an interconnected system?
So that's a really tricky part. It's going to depend a lot on your institution and how policies are created. I know that my partner is at a university. They teach there, and they were recently successful in getting pronouns and preferred names added to student registrations. And they did that by starting within a small group within their department and working out from there. And that's when you're within an institution that has interconnected departments like that and policies, you really have to start small, build your foundation, and kind of build up from there and work through the framework. It can take a lot of time. It can take a lot of effort, but it's worth it, because once you do that, if you change it for your museum or library within a university, you're often changing it for the university as a whole as well. So you're helping not just your patrons and staff, but all of those students as well who are trans.
I think the biggest thing is that being brave has to start somewhere, and oftentimes boards and directors and kind of the top, right, that's not where the bravery comes from in these situations. So starting where you can is really important to prove that it's kind of not as scary as it seems. My institution, that institution with the name tags, they were very nervous about everything that was going to happen, right? This is an institution that has an LGBTQ specific like affinity group for members. We are hosting like queer exhibits, specifically one called Art After Stonewall. So there's they were doing a lot, but they were still very nervous about what was going to happen. And when nothing happened, it was a lot easier to then move forward. And 4 institutions and 6 institutions in Columbus are now moving towards that, including 2 other museums that I work at, a library system, and the Girl Scouts of Ohio's Heartland just added staff pronouns to their name tags. So it has to start somewhere. And if you can do that, then that's great.
I'll add in briefly also that some universities actually might be like farther ahead of some museums in terms of trans inclusionary policies. Really depends on the university and the museum. But I had a friend who was going to Brown University in Rhode Island, and when he came out, the university had an LGBT liaison, they had a whole office, they had a plan in place, they had like everything was set up for him. And when I came out at the museum here, I basically just took his suggestions from Brown. So some universities are really on top of it. Again, can totally vary, but there are examples to point to of people who are doing well. Have, I think, at least 2 more questions. One is, when a volunteer or coworker comes out as trans, what are some good supportive things to say?
I think it's important to remember not to overdo it. A lot of people are very eager to show their support. So when trans people come out, we hear a lot of kind of over-the-top things. So I think just congratulate them if you feel like it's necessary, if you work closely with them. Congratulate them in the same way you would for any other life event. And that sort of thing. Don't make it a huge deal. Don't make it about you. I would suggest not telling them that they're brave. That's something we hear a lot, and we don't really feel brave when we come out, most of us, because we're just doing what we have to do. We've gotten to the point to where we have to transition. So it's not really brave, it's just surviving. I don't know. That's just one cliche that comes to mind to avoid, but just don't make it over the top. Allison?
I would definitely agree. I'm just kind of living my life. I'm not particularly brave most days. I would recommend thanking them for feeling comfortable sharing with you. And then I would leave it at that, right? Like if they want to share more, then I feel like they will. The only thing, like asking if there's anything they need, if you're like their manager, or if they need anything institutionally from you, a follow-up, a quick follow-up about that would be helpful. And there are some great resources for that in the toolkit, because they may need a new name tag or, things like that.
Yeah, when I came out here, I was very certain to make sure that HR knew and my supervisors knew and that all of my coworkers knew that I just wanted things to be business as normal. I didn't want this to be a huge event. I didn't want anybody to make a big deal out of it. And everybody respected that, and I really appreciated it. So.
Can you speak to the order of words to refer to a person who is transgender? I think kind of along the lines of the concept of person first language, and is it more appropriate to say a person who is trans or transgender, or a trans person or trans people? How do we feel about that?
I think the biggest thing is that transgender is an adjective. It's not a noun. So making sure that you are using it that way, right? Allison is trans. Allison is a trans person. It's trans space person, not trans person, one word. And then I think just being really respectful of what people tell you the language they want you to use is, and being really thoughtful about that.
Yeah, I personally haven't heard people really use person who is trans really ever. I know that's something that is very more common in the disability community, even though there are varied opinions about it there. Disabled person versus person with a disability, but I haven't really heard person who is trans. Usually just trans person. And then there's one more question, I think, and then maybe it's time to wrap up. But someone said, I'm interning at a very small museum this summer, working with curatorial collections, doing visitor evaluation. Do you have any suggestions beyond what has been discussed over the last hour on how I can make trans advocacy part of the work I do during the relatively short period I'll be there for?
I think this is a situation that if I were you, I would go all in, because that's the kind of person that I am. Look for every single way you can make it part of what you do there, especially if you're only going to be there a short amount of time. I figure for me, that's the time that I can make the most noise. You don't have to do that. You can look for little ways. If you're writing visitor evaluations, making them as inclusive as possible, right? Are you looking at the ways that objects are described in your collection? I've seen some really strange ways that things have been described, if it's a trans subject or a trans artist, or, if it's somehow related to trans history. If you're looking at curatorial and you're writing exhibitions, making sure that you're using singular they when it's appropriate on your labels instead of, she, he with the slash. However, you can make things as inclusive as you can, and then pushing to make those changes stick when you leave. I know that's one of the things that the task force has talked about doing, is kind of guidelines for interpretation around trans objects and artists and history and things like that. So I say go for it, but that's just me.
Yeah, absolutely. Being a squeaky wheel, especially since you're there for such a short amount of time, I think is the best way to approach it. And I know we've mentioned the toolkit multiple times, but it has the coworkers guide has a few strategies in it for how you can help start institutional changes. Um, so that is unfortunately all the time we have for today. I wanted to thank all of you for joining us. Um, if you have any questions that you didn't get to ask, or if you think of any after this, feel free to contact us. I sent a file at the beginning. It's at the very top of the chat that has all of our contact information on it. So feel free to reach out to us that way. Remember that being an ally takes work, and this is a huge step that you've taken being here, starting to become a trans ally. There's no such thing as a passive ally. So you always have to be putting in the work. You always have to be standing up for the trans community, especially when we're under attack so often. If you're interested in learning more, participating more, at AAM we'll be doing a panel and then a roundtable, and then we'll be doing another webinar, like I mentioned, in November in observance of International Trans Day of Remembrance. And that'll be a much deeper dive into using trans stories within collections and within programming and teaching and all of that. So thank you so much.
Oh, and it looks like Alex just shared the article that was written about gender on visitor surveys. Perfect.
All right, thanks everyone.